To a shooting on Canal Street in broad daylight in a crowded intersection. So what makes this apparent road rage case from Thursday even more bizarre are the circumstances of the woman who was arrested, as well as some very timely witnesses. Investigative reporter Mike Pearlstein explains.
The sidewalks were filled with pedestrians and traffic was busy on Canal Street at lunch hour Thursday when an altercation in the middle of the street brought everything to a stop with the sound of gunfire. The commotion broke out here at the corner of Decatur and Canal at about 1 o'clock yesterday in an apparent road rage incident involving a woman in a car with a young child. Witnesses say that what started with harsh words quickly escalated. Workers who were in the area at the time told me that 4 shots rang out despite a crowd of people waiting outside this restaurant waiting to be seated. This woman, 23-year-old Ashante Smith, now stands booked with aggravated assault with a firearm. Sources say a toddler who was in the car with her was placed into the care of the Office of Children and Family Services. Even more unfortunate for the suspect was the timing of the outburst. Police said that 8th District officers made an arrest almost immediately, and coincidentally, they were joined by a large group of officers who had just left the Sheraton after a police awards ceremony. Some of the officers leaving the ceremony witnessed the disturbance and helped in the speedy arrest. As of late Friday afternoon, Smith's bail had not yet been set. Mike Pearlstein, Eyewitness News.
Well, now we just got word that Smith's first in-court appearance has wrapped up and a magistrate commissioner set her bail at $40,000.